All right. And let's see here. Okay. So we have a few things to go over since, first of all, it is the first, like, I guess it's the start of the week of Project Week. I guess today, technically it's Tuesday, so it started yesterday. But, we're kind of into it now. So first of all, congrats to the people who, competed on Kaggle. I think our final team for the private leaderboard, I'm just going to share my screen since that's just going to be the easiest, is, oh, cool. So yeah, that's right. It's Team Talon, which was Andy and Jessica, who got like just inched over on the lowest mean squared error and stuff. And I know that, this is all like very practice. You guys are all learning and everything like that.
Congrats to them.
Yeah, definitely. And honestly, congrats to all of you guys who participated. So, we have here 4 different teams. One team, Brennan, was just by herself. But we had, like Jam over here, Salvero, what was it, Jeffrey, Mike, and then we also had Christine, Nadine, and Steven. So I kind of wanted to talk about this too before we talk about the Mod1 project, stuff like this, or sorry, Mod2 project. And I just thought it was really interesting. Or I guess, well, let me ask you guys, would you guys like to kind of talk a little bit about this Kaggle thing, or go right Mod2 project, and we'll come back to this Kaggle information because I think it's kind of interesting. Give me a thumbs up. Sorry, I don't give you guys, like you guys are all muted, so I realized. Give me a thumbs up if you want me to continue on with the Mod2 project intro, and we'll talk about that. And then we'll save Kaggle for later. Or if you tell thumbs down if you want Kaggle, that feels weird, but Kaggle first. So Kaggle second, Kaggle first. All right, so most people are giving me thumbs up, so Kaggle second, if I remember that right. All right, so let's talk about then the mod project. So let's hear. So I just pulled up the GitHub repo. And so the Mod2 project, you guys, quick thumbs up. Who's already looked at the repo for the Mod2 project? Give me a thumbs up. I see some nods, see some hand raises, see some head shakes. That's okay too. All right. So first of all, good thing to read this through. Those of you guys who have read it through too, I'm going to say a few things, caveats, just like before. One in particular is the number of slides. Don't worry about the number of slides. There's a few things in here that you don't have to worry about too much. So the basic idea here is that you guys will be focusing on a linear regression project. Excuse me. And in this repo itself, so if you haven't already, you'll want to get at the very least this data right here, the kchousedata.csv, which is based around, if I remember this, King County house sales data set, which for the record, you can find the original data set where this is based off. However, I would say be careful with that just because the data set that's on here has been at least slightly modified by the curriculum writers. And it's not a really big deal or anything like that. I think mostly it's just so you guys don't, are tempted to like use someone else's like material. But also like it does kind of keep out there's a few differences and stuff, and that might kind of give, during a project assessment or talking with your peers, might be a little confusing. So just make sure you use this data set, but it should be very similar. But the idea here is that a data set was given to you, the King County house sales data set, which is basically a bunch of information about houses and then along with their price. And your goal basically, your target variable is going to be the sales price of these houses along with all these features. I think there's something like 20-ish features in total in this data set. And so your kind of goal is to basically build, a good linear regression model. And so this always has a business case. And I'm trying to remember specifically, I always like, I should always like be a little more like careful with how I read this, but I'm like, this is how I'm going to give it to you guys, is that your business problem is basically saying there's some stakeholders that have given you this information, and your job is to basically predict, how much these houses are going to cost. However, I'm going to give it a little bit more leeway for you guys, is that, and some people like this, some people don't like it because it's more option, but create a hypothetical stakeholders. And your hypothetical stakeholders can basically say they have this data and they're giving this to you and they want information about house prices, but there's a few situations this can happen. So one situation I kind of give people if they, kind of want to play around with is imagine your stakeholders are investors in like the housing market. And one scenario could be, for example, like maybe these set of investors, their thing is that they want to take houses and what's it called, like remodel, flip these houses, like do some improvements to houses and sell it for a profit. And so that's going to have certain needs, for them. Like, for example, like, You know, do they put in another bedroom? You know, do they convert this garage over into a bedroom or whatever? You know, like, was it worth keeping the garage, or was it worth, you know, making it into a bedroom? Think of how much cost that is. So I think that I like that scenario a lot because it kind of creates a little bit of interest, like what things matter, what things matter less. If you come up with a different scenario of your stakeholders, that's perfectly good too. Just make sure you put that as the very beginning part of your project of saying, these are my hypothetical stakeholders and these are their needs and these are their wants. Another similar kind of stakeholders would be like, imagine a company that's like a Zillow clone, where maybe they want to have a better accurate, like, or an accurate estimate of how houses are going to sell, so they can approach people of saying, hey, you should have, hey, like, did you know your house is good this much or worth this much? You should think about selling it, or, you know, use our service or something like that. So whatever, you can be as creative as you want with this. Just make sure you talk to me about it as you kind of like form this business problem. And then from that business problem, or I guess like, yeah, that business scenario, business problem, you're going to kind of create now like, okay, what questions and what things do these stakeholders, you know, really care about? And that will be the basis of your project. And I think once you have that, that's going to make it a lot easier to understand like, what are your goals and next steps? Okay, does that make sense to people? Cool, I'm seeing nods. All right, awesome. So let's see here. So the main thing though, like considering like you're doing your project, this is kind of like your very first like mod project of like an end-to-end data science project. So what that means basically is, if you think back to our, you know, cycle, our data science life cycle, right? We basically have our first, our business understanding. We have to understand what the problem is. And then we get data acquisition. Well, this is going to be relatively easy, at least for the most part. You have the data right here. You can supplement this data, but I will give you a warning is, try to start off at the very least here with this data and go with that first. That way you don't run out of time trying to supplement it with new data and trying to combine, because you guys have seen this before, trying to web scrape, or even if the data is like already there in the CSV form, even combining together can be a lot of work, right? So just make sure you start off with at least this thing. That's all that's required for the project. And of course, if you want to and you have more time and you're curious, you can try to supplement this data in however you want, right? So data acquisition is more or less done for you. You can play around with it. And then the next step basically is doing your cleaning, right? So you want to take this data or whatever data you have and clean through it, make sure, you know, what do you do with missing values? You know, are the mistakes in there? You know, that kind of stuff, you know, get a feel for what might be missing and all that stuff, right? So that's kind of like your first step. I think this data set, if I remember right, is pretty clean, but I will tell you that there's probably some stuff in there that you might want to check out, right? So this is kind of like where you go between cleaning and exploration, okay? And then your next step is that exploration step, right? And of course, you know, I say these are steps, but you can kind of fluctuate between them and stuff like that. And you'll have to order your Jupyter notebook to make it as clean as possible for someone to follow through. So your next step really is your exploration. And your exploration, you know, hopefully part of that's going to be cleaning, trying to figure out what's there, but also kind of figuring out, all right, what features, you know, represent or are correlated well with your target variable, in this case, the housing price. So you want to look for that. You want to look maybe to see if they're interacting features. Kind of basically, as you're doing this exploration, that second half, you're thinking of like, what can I do to make a good model? What features are going to be important in this model that I'm going to build? And that's kind of what your exploration step is. And honestly, you might create a model, right? Later, like this is kind of like, you create a model and then you realize, ooh, like I think this feature might actually work really well if I do that. And you might go back to exploration, test that stuff out, and then create a new model. That's perfectly fine too. You know, this is kind of iterative where you go back and forth between different steps. Okay, everyone follow me so far? Cool. All right, so then as we go into exploration, I like, this is all very fuzziness. That's why I don't like saying like, oh, next step and then step after that. But your kind of step after this is your feature engineering. And again, that's going to be related to your exploration. And your feature engineering, it's going to kind of be more focused on your model aspect. So think of things like looking for p-values that are basically are small p-values, right, for your feature. So think of like the OLS stats models, like ANOVA tables and stuff like this, of saying, okay, like are these features actually doing a good job predicting the target and stuff like this. So beyond just saying your R-squared metric or your MSE, you're seeing, hey, like, does this feature actually make sense to keep in there, or it should be zero? This also could be for your feature engineering, right, is looking for interaction terms or polynomial terms and stuff like this. One suggestion I have is always start with a simple model first. Like try it out, right? Just see you know, what if you don't do any interacting terms, polynomial terms, and just making sure you can get to that point from your clean data to your features, right, to doing a basic model. And that can really be your base model, because then you're not doing any extra things to it yet. And then you can start adding in extra interacting terms and stuff. If you start with interacting terms and start with polynomial and try to do that really fancy transformations and stuff like that, it can get you in this like rabbit hole where you forget like what thing really matters and stuff, where at least if you start with the basic one, you can iterate off the top of that. Does that make sense so far? Cool. All right. So your feature engineering, and then of course your modeling part. And again, you might do multiple models. I would say at the very least, try to do 3 different types of models. And when I say different types, I mean something that is significant, not significantly, but like different from just saying, oh, let me just try all the linear terms, you know, and then say, oh, what if I just do linear terms with like just these linear terms? Like try to play around with like polynomial features, just linear terms, interacting features. Like try to think of it like your different models and you're kind of comparing each one of them if possible. Does that make sense to people? Cool. And stop me again if you have any questions or if I'm not being clear. Yeah, Jessica.
I have a question. So I know how to like save a model with Pickle and do version control. Are there other ways that we can keep track in our Jupyter notebook of doing different models and changing things around?
Yeah, so one thing I would suggest is as best as possible, right? Try to keep like those sections like defined, like, oh, this is cleaning, right? And kind of define that part like we did last time. When you get to the feature engineering into like modeling, that might be a good time to make like subsections where you might be doing feature engineering in modeling as like one subsection. So you might, you know, let's say like what I'll try to do is like, oh, I'll say like simple model, you know, or like, you know, baseline model. And I'll kind of proceed with that, a little bit of evaluation. And then another subsection that says something like, you know, let's say I tried like polynomial terms, you know, in my model, and, you know, go off of that. And so labeling a little bit like kind of like sections, like with the markdown, can be really helpful to kind of like make it easy to understand. And then once you have, let's say you have 3 to 4 different models, right, that you're kind of talking about in your notebook, have like a section that talks about comparing these models all together. And that'd be kind of like your evaluation section in that model, like after your modeling. Does that make sense? Okay, yeah. And everyone has their kind of like different way of organizing and stuff like this. One thing people always ask me is like, oh man, this notebook's so long. Like, you know, like, is this bad? It's long. It's like, no, like I would say there's a lot of notebooks that are perfectly great that are super long, and that's fine. Some people, for whatever reason, just doesn't like the feel of that. You can separate them out into different notebooks. Like maybe you have just like your cleaning, you know, notebook where you do just all the cleaning separately. You can keep that as a separate notebook. And we'll talk about this more maybe like in the future, but one thing you can do as well is define like cleaning steps in your notebook. Or sorry, like you can create cleaning functions and then import those into the notebook where basically you create that kind of like part. So this would be so similar to ETL, extract, transform, load. You might have these kind of steps outside of your notebook. You know, you test it out maybe in a separate notebook, but then you implement it as separate functions and then import them over and just basically say, oh, basically it'd be like a cleaning function, like, oh, apply cleaning. And it does everything that you'd want. And you might document that separate out of your notebook. It just kind of depends how you do things. I would suggest unless you already have a firm idea of exactly how you want to structure this, I would suggest making it just one big notebook and just section it off with Markdown. Because that's a lot easier to separate each part out than like having it all separate and then trying to combine it together. Make sense to everyone? Cool. All right. But yeah, going back a little bit structure then, right, is that you have your models. You might have like kind of like a subsection where you do a little model, do a little evaluation of that specific model, then try to iterate on top of that with a new type of model, you know, maybe make it more complex, maybe make less complex, whatever, maybe add new features, right? And kind of do that per section. And then you would move on from your feature engineering modeling section, right, to kind of your evaluation section. And your evaluation is really kind of determining, all right, what do I do with these models? You know, determining which model would you basically say, hey, to the stakeholders, use this model to make predictions with. So this is going to be talk about like comparing those models, seeing what makes the most sense for your stakeholders. And then I would say this leads right into your insights of being like, okay, how do you interpret this model? How do you talk to someone and say, how should this model be used? What are some, what's it called? Like not dangers, but like, what are some issues about using this model? Like what things didn't you consider? What things should be considered in the future? What are the limitations? That's what I'm looking for. The limitations of your model. So like, that's kind of like an important part to talk about in your stakeholders. And again, that leads pretty closely into your conclusion and your overall results in summary. Okay. So that's kind of like the overall structure of like what this looks like. I know it was a lot going through like all that part. But honestly, like if I just look at like data science lifecycle, I know that picture's gonna come up real quick. Yeah, I like this picture. It's pretty general without imposing like any particular structure. Is this guy right here. I think I sent one of the notebooks. I'm sure you guys seen it at this point. Again, that business understanding, I call it like data acquisition. This is data mining, but acquisition is really probably a closer term for it. Data cleaning, right? And then your data exploration, feature engineering, your actual modeling step. Data visualization, I don't know. I don't like to keep this separate. This is more like understanding, like evaluation of your model itself. So basically, you like communicate the findings, right? What are the important parts of this? This can be in visualizations, but this can also just be like talking about it in general. And this is kind of like where your conclusions kind of go. And even though it's kind of like the circles, it makes it look like step 1, step 2, step 3. You might go back and forth between different steps. Okay, cool. All right, any questions on like what this overall flow looks like? How are you feeling on this so far? Thumbs up? Feeling like got the idea of it? All right. So yeah, so you can kind of think this is like Mod1's project was kind of like doing like steps 1 through like 4, really, and then like skipping over to 7. We're just adding these 2 parts really, are feature engineering and predictive modeling, which we really didn't do last time. Really, we're doing much more exploration and then analysis. So we're adding this extra step in here. Okay, cool. So let's go back to the repo. So the next question is like, okay, what do I need to actually turn in, right? So it's basically the same exact stuff as before. You have your technical notebook, which is the thing that we'll talk about in our project assessment. So that's the one that you're going to go through and, you know, guide someone through talking about your process. Again, one big thing here is make sure you, I'm a big stickler on this, is putting down your markdown cells, like your voice, right? Written your thoughts down on paper. And a lot of times when we're doing our project assessments, like the Mod 1 project assessments, you guys all know like what you're like you guys know what you did. And the thing is, I usually tell people, it's like, oh, you knew exactly what to talk about, but it's nowhere in your notebook. So if someone just looked at your notebook, they wouldn't really know why you did these things. So just kind of reiterate on that. And what I would say is, especially right before your assessment, kind of walk through it. You know, you don't have to like literally practice it out, but just kind of walk through it. And just, you know, if you're noticing parts that are like, oh, I didn't put any information here, but I can hear myself talking about it, you might want to put that in there. Okay, cool. So any questions on this technical? I think for the most part, pretty understandable. This is where most of your work is going to be, right? So cool. And then one part I didn't really emphasize last time, but it should be your README. And we'll talk about READMEs maybe over this next, you know, week or two. Is I think there's a lot of potential to make a nice README to make sure it's clear like what you're doing. We'll talk more about that. There's some sample READMEs if I remember right. I think there was a sample README. Otherwise, I'll give you guys some sample READMEs. But usually this is going to be basically a summary. So if someone looks up your GitHub repo and they see what your project is, they can quickly look at the README and understand, 1, how should I run this? 2, what was the goal like of this actual like repo? And 3, things, you know, maybe overall analysis and stuff like this. So there's a bunch of ways you can do this. I'm pretty like flexible in how you want to structure it, but it should look better than just being like, I did work essentially. Like it should be probably like more than just like a paragraph on your README. Make sense? And we'll talk more details about this for sure. And then of course we have the last 2 parts, or actually last 3 parts. Your PowerPoint, right? Your slideshow, your presentation. This is your non-technical presentation. And remember, this is about, your goal is about a 5-minute presentation. Definitely not less than 3 minutes. Definitely less than 10 minutes. If it's over 10 minutes, that's really way too long. I would say even 10 minutes is long. I would say between 5 to 8 minutes, it's really your goal on like trying to get that presentation in there. And this is to your non-technical stakeholders. And the main focus on your non-technical stakeholders is, in the end, you know, they don't really care your analysis. They don't care. It's like, oh, I tried this polynomial interacting terms. Like, it's like fancy words, but they're not really going to care about that. What they really want to know is, hey, what do you recommend to me? And why do you recommend this to me? And so you don't have to go into full details of being like, exactly all this stuff, remember, non-technical, but their main focus is that you want to say, hey, these are my recommendations. These are why you should do these things. Okay. And so we saw some examples from Mod1 Project stuff. I don't know, do you have a question?
So what kind of visualizations should we provide with this presentation?
Yeah, so that's a good point. So one thing I would say is that let's say I'm going to use this scenario because I like this scenario, is that pretend like there's investors that want to flip a house. So they want to make improvements and then resell it. So, when I make my model, I might find certain features being really important and stuff like that. Let's say one of the features is like location. Well, it doesn't really make sense for me flipping a house. I'm not going to pick up the house and move it somewhere else. Like, that's not really a thing. So I wouldn't really focus too much on that. But maybe I find out like adding a new bedroom is like, ooh, super like important, right? Like, it's like, oh, it turns out you could like make a huge amount of money on this. So what I might say is like, okay, like my recommendation is for you to add on a bedroom if possible, right? If you can add a bedroom, or I'm going to give another scenario. Pretend like we found out garages don't really matter in price, but adding a bedroom is. I might say, hey, like based on our model, garages don't really affect the sales price, like if it has a garage or not. But adding a bedroom turns out to be super important in the model prediction. So like my suggestion is like, hey, convert the garage into a bedroom, right? That would be kind of like my recommendation. And then you use visualization to help support this. So visualization doesn't literally have to be a plot. Visualization can be something to emphasize to your stakeholders more than just saying, hey, convert a garage to a bedroom. So what I might show, for example, is looking at a very simple plot, if I want to do a plot, of just like number of bedrooms and the price of the house. And I can maybe show them, say, hey, like we can see the number of house, like as the bedrooms go up, we can see the sale price go up. And like, ah, cool, I like this. And then maybe I might do, if I had some graphical evidence of garages, it's like, hey, like garages don't really affect anything on the sales price. So I might even let's say there's a metric, I don't even think there is a feature in here that has garage or doesn't have a garage. I wouldn't want to just put a bunch of data points and a bunch of data points, right? I might say the two averages, like average with a garage. I might say like an average with a three-bedroom house with a garage, that price. And then next to it, like in big, bold, numbers too, average price for a three-bedroom with no garage, right? And see what the difference between that is. And I might say, hey, these two numbers and those numbers, I'm just imagining like big, bold, like numbers, like 150,000 versus 155,000 average. And maybe one's in red, one in blue or something like that. Something to emphasize. And the idea is that that visualization should stick in the stakeholder's mind. It's like when they go away, they're like, hey, remember that like one slide with the big numbers, and they should be able to know what those big numbers mean. So that could be one way you can visualize it as well. Again, the plot is probably closer to what most people will do for visualizations, but make sure you're not trying to, when you're doing a plot for non-technical, you're not trying to show the data, if this makes sense. They don't really care about the specifics of the data. What they care about is the specifics of the results and insights. So you might, for example, have just the line. Let's say there's a line that, you just have price and then bedrooms, right? And then, you would normally have your scatter plot with the data points and then like a line that goes through there showing the prediction, or, some kind of regression line. You might just show the regression line because that's more understandable. They don't care about the single data points unless you feel that's really relevant for them to understand what you're trying to say. And that's what I'm talking about when I say, make your plots digestible for the non-technical person, because I don't care about the specific data points. If you want to add that in there, just because maybe you think it looks nice or whatever, I would say downplay those data points, right? Is make them, maybe slightly lower alpha so they kind of blend into the background. Maybe you don't plot all, I think there's 20,000 data points in this data set. Don't plot all 20,000, only plot like maybe a small fraction of that so it's not overwhelming. So they can see that the data points still match along those lines and stuff like that. Maybe you want to talk about something about those data points in relationship to your line. But the important part is making sure whatever you're showing in the visualization is relevant, right, to the stakeholders. Make sure it's something they care about. Two is that whatever you show on your plot, you should be talking about it out loud. So if there's something like, let's say there's an outlier on your data point, you should be talking about that data point. That's visualization. if it's not important, then maybe it shouldn't be there at all, if that makes sense. So like, again, your plot, your slide is meant not to convey data, but to convey your insights and recommendations. Does that make sense to people? Okay, it's a subtle distinction, but I think if you think in those terms, it's a lot easier to kind of design a visualization that emphasizes your points. Okay. Cool. Does that answer your question, Alvaro? Like some ideas of like how to visualization? And you can be very creative with this. I've seen some people do some really creative things. I personally, like this person I'm thinking in particular was very good at visualizations, and like I like would see their visualizations. I'm like, wow, like that was really good. I wouldn't have come out that myself. And that's honestly a skill, and you know, maybe it's also a little bit of natural talent.
Yeah, no, that answers it.
Cool.
For sure.
Awesome. Awesome.
Yeah, we're just trying to get across what the benefit is to them, not how we got to the point, you know, how we got to that. It just, this is what we found. Here it is in a nutshell. Boom, boom. This is how it'll benefit you.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right.
Perfect. Yeah. And again, that's why it's non-technical, right? Non-technical just meaning that like they don't care about the details of your analysis. If they do care about it, you can show them, right? Like in your Jupyter notebook. But main focus is saying, hey, what are your recommendations? Let's see here. I just want to make sure. Oh yeah, make sure. I think everyone did this. Just make sure the PDF, preferably PDF, just because it's easy for anyone to look at. They don't have to download it. They don't have to worry about having specific software. If you use PowerPoint or Keynote or you know whatever you use, if they can't easily access it, it's going to be harder for them to do. So it's easy to just do a PDF in there. And again, between 5 to 8 minutes. I think it's somewhere in here. It says something like 10 slides. Don't worry about the slide numbers, right? The important part is the time and if it's conveying the right information. Okay. And then we have the blog posts. So the blog post is the one associated with the mod project itself, right? So what I suggest is picking some aspect of the project that's of interest of you that you could talk about and write about that thing. I think in here it probably suggests something like, talk about the overall of your project. I would suggest, if you feel comfortable doing that, cool. But I would say it's usually easier to pick a very specific part of your project, like some technical aspect, and talk about it in a technical way. So you can talk about linear regression. You can talk about, let's say you did something cool with the visualization. Let's say you did something like you plotted out the locations, right, on like a geospatial map or something. You can talk about that. If that's something you learned and you want to kind of share that and kind of make that information, you can make that as your blog post. Okay. Cool. And then last part's the video walkthrough. Basically, like, don't stress out about this. I think you guys kind of got the idea of it. It's basically a way for you to practice your presentation. So the video walkthrough is your non-technical presentation. And yeah, it's also a way for us to document it too. It's like, oh, this is the presentation. So we can kind of use that as kind of like, oh yes, this was kind of done. Don't worry if you like do little hiccups or whatever and stuff like that. But all of this should be done, including the video and blog post, should be turned in and done before we do our project assessment. So it's important that we won't have our project assessment, like our little one-on-one extended, until all those parts are turned in. That way we can make sure everything's knocked off. Okay, cool. All right, so those are the deliverables. We can go through the details through here. I also have it on the repo about like advice, right? You guys know I'm talking about, like that little notebook I had before. That should still apply. I'm just gonna pull it up real quick. Projects, general advice. It's loading. So this, once it loads, this general idea of like the notebook and like what you should do, that's all in here, and it still applies to this project and all the other projects too. Okay, cool. All right, any questions at all about this project or anything I went over? How are you feeling? Feeling pretty good about this project? Like, cool, awesome. All right, cool. So make sure you guys read this through. If you guys have questions, of course, ask on Slack, right? And go with that stuff. All right, so, oh, and also know that the rubric is here too. Actually, I think this is the updated rubric. So just remember, the rubric's pretty much the same as last time. So just making sure you have at least accomplished here. Basically, this is the way I pass you. As long as you have the accomplished or X factor marked down for each section, I consider that a pass. I might still say suggestions for you to do and stuff like this. And remember, this is also good practice for you. So don't just simply look for, marking everything off on the accomplished side. But this is at least what you should, at the very bare minimum, do. Okay, cool. So we'll talk about then some questions on here, and then, yeah, we have about 25 minutes, and then we'll talk about the Kaggle competition too, which I think will be interesting.